separated by gender. Yeah. Which is understandable due to capacities, but it's something I think we should all be advocating for, as they're the ones most impacted by.
Most countries would have more developed statistics on it. We have one more. Professor, this is where I'd like to have a good pronunciation. Well, you'll see. From Tanzania, we have another presentation that will give us greater idea on legislative needs. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Just see next.
Good morning. Yeah, very unfortunately, I was, I'm in the other group on migration. And my presentation is equally relevant there because it's related a little bit to migration in rangelands in Tanzania, but also I would say in a lot of African countries, especially in semi-arid areas. So can I have the next slide? So first I wanted to explain the nature or the environmental characteristics of what I call rangelands, and these are either semi-arid or arid. And in Tanzania, it's approximately 50% of the country is semi or dry, with a rainfall between 400 and 800 millimeters per annum. But in these areas, although they are dry, you get pockets of what we call inland drainage systems where you have small lakes or where water is retained. Is actually surface runoff is retained during the dry season, and if it's not heavily utilized, it can stay until the next season. And this is very important for livestock as well as wildlife, especially in the dry season. These would be the main source of water. And then, interestingly, they support a substantial population of both human and livestock, but also wildlife. Our famous Serengeti National Parks, also Ngorongoro Conservation Area, they are all located in these areas where we have huge migrations of wildlife, annual migrations of wildlife. And to a large degree, although there are other tribes people, the Maasai are the commonest people, and as a result, they are termed Maasailand or Maasai steppes. Steppes because these are grassland plains, and you hardly have forest or woodlands, but you could have bushed grasslands. So people here are really nomadic pastoralists by nature and by tradition. They've been moving from one place to another in search of pasture, but also for water, especially during the dry season. The next slide. So my interest here was to ask questions. For example, what does climate change mean to the gender differences to men and women? Whether there are differences between men and women as related to climate changes, how can gender and climate justice be ensured, how is vulnerability to climate change gender dependent, if it is, and what can be done to mitigate these changes and disparities. The next slide. The next slide, I explain a little bit the causes of climate change in Tanzania in summary form, particularly in the rangeland areas where we had rinderpest during the turn of the 20th century, which killed a lot of livestock but also wildlife, which means you have a habitat wildlife-livestock interrelationship in terms of utilization of the pastures. So rinderpest wiped out a lot of livestock and wildlife, and the result was an improvement in rangeland conditions. There are a lot of bush growth, but in some cases even woodland growth. But then this became a problem. We had a lot of sassaflies coming in because of bush encroachment, and then there was a lot of burning, but there was a lot of clearing of this bush, especially before independence by the colonial governments, to reduce the effect of sassaflies, which had an impact on human beings, but also on livestock as well. Also, originally there was a lot of burning. It's a very common burning rangelands in order to boost pasture productivity in terms of having green biomass for livestock, but also for wildlife. So it was very common to burn. When the colonialists came, they started to restrict bush burning, fires, and in so doing, you have another interface between, if you burn, constantly burn, you discourage woodland productivity, woodland growth. You encourage grasslands. If you don't burn, you come up with a lot of bush, and eventually it turns into woodland. Now, if you are interested in livestock keeping, you don't want the woodland, you don't want the bushes, you want the grasslands. So there is an interesting interface between livestock, wildlife, and the type of habitat that you are creating. Now, this was followed by an introduction of introduction of villagization program. This was after independence. The former president, the late Julius Nyerere at that time, was interested in putting people, a scattered population, into communities, so-called villages. And in so doing, we had a change in the pastoral communities. Because people here were migrating all the time in search of pastures and water. And then these were forced to stay in villages. So these people were migrating, now were sedentary, and they to change their lifestyle from nomadic pastoralism to sort of settled, to stay in settlements. So this was imposed on them. And as you will see in the next slide, before I go into what actually happened, just a few indicators of climate change in Tanzania. We've been able to measure, after monitoring for some time, temperature rises of up to, on average, 0.2 degrees rise in temperature. We have declining rainfall, annual rainfall, since 1970. And these are measurable. We're expanding dryland areas. So instead of the so-called, I said 50% of the countries might be getting worse, expanding to more than 50%. We're retreating inland lakes.